The boy with his eyes. He built an empire, but he never believed he could father a child until one impossible moment in a faraway town. His eyes met something that carried not only his most intimate trait, but also the weight of a choice he might no longer be able to undo. The cold morning air cut across Arthur Bennett's face like a knife, but it wasn't the cold that made his hands tremble as he held his cell phone to his ear. On the other end of the line, the lawyer's voice sounded distant, almost unreal, repeating words that seemed to come from another world. Paternity confirmed. 99.9% genetic compatibility. He let the phone slip from his fingers and fall onto the stone floor of the town square, where he could still see the remains of the previous day's artisan market. 3 years. 3 years lost. 3 years that Ava had grown up without him. 3 years that Eleanor had rebuilt a whole life far from Chicago. Far from him. Far from the pain he had sown with his cruel words. Arthur knelt and picked up the phone with fingers that couldn't stop shaking. The memory of the little girl running among the market stalls, laughing with the same joyous sound he recognized from old photos of his own childhood, came back like a punch to the gut. Ava, his daughter, the little girl he had rejected even before he knew her, whom he had called a lie, a medical impossibility, a betrayal. The doctor had been clear on the phone minutes before the lawyer's call. Mr. Bennett, infections like the one you had can cause temporary infertility. It's not uncommon for a partial recovery to happen years later. Your body may have gradually healed. Words that came 3 years too late. 3 years after he had destroyed the only woman he had ever truly loved. 3 years after he had missed his daughter's first steps, first words, and first smiles. The Washington wind swayed the branches of the trees around the square, casting shadows on the ground like ghosts of all the mornings he had missed. Mornings when Ava woke up calling Mama. Mornings when Eleanor made coffee alone. Mornings when his daughter learned new words without him being there to hear them. Arthur brought his hands to his face and felt something wet trickle between his fingers. Tears. When was the last time he had cried? Probably the day he received the infertility diagnosis, 15 years ago, when he decided he would never be a father, never form a family, never open his heart completely to anyone. Now he was there, alone in the empty square, with the paternity certificate in his jacket pocket and a hollow in his chest that seemed to consume everything around him. Eleanor hadn't even answered his calls for the last 2 days. She knew he had discovered the truth. She knew he was in town and had chosen silence as a response, the same silence he had imposed on her when he needed to have listened, to have trusted, to have believed in the love she offered him, along with the news of the miracle she was carrying. Ava existed. She was his daughter, and he had been the biggest coward in the world. A cold decision. 3 years earlier, Arthur Bennett was defined by an implacable routine. He woke up at 5:30 in the morning in his minimalist apartment in Logan Square, drank black coffee while reviewing financial reports on his tablet, and was in the office before 7. The Chicago Tower was his kingdom. From the 23rd floor, he commanded a real estate empire he had built brick by brick, contract by contract, always alone, always trusting only himself. Eleanor had entered his life like a colorful hurricane in the gray of his controlled existence. They met at a contemporary art exhibition where she was presenting sculptures made from recycled materials. He was there, only out of social obligation, accompanying a major client. When his eyes met hers across the gallery, Eleanor was laughing too loudly, gesturing with her hands as she explained her creations. She had blue paint under her nails, and she was wearing a printed dress that looked like it had been painted by hand. "Do you understand art?" she had asked, approaching him with a smile that lit up the whole room. I understand investments, he replied, trying to maintain his professional composure. How sad, she said, tilting her head. Art shouldn't be an investment. It should be a passion. That word, passion, had resonated in his mind for weeks. Arthur didn't know passion. He knew goals, strategies, measurable results. But Eleanor constantly challenged him, questioning his worldview with simple questions that left him speechless. Why don't you have any plants at home? Why don't you listen to music while you work? When was the last time you just stopped to watch the sunset? For 2 years, she had tried to tear down his barriers with infinite patience. She brought flowers to his office, left little drawings taped to his bathroom mirror, and cooked traditional American dishes he had never tried despite being born in Chicago. Eleanor knew his story. She knew about the medical diagnosis he carried like armor. She knew he used that information to maintain an emotional distance from anyone who might hurt him. I really don't want children, he would say every time the topic came up indirectly. My life is complete just the way it is. Eleanor never argued. She just smiled with that mysterious air he could never fully decipher. She talked about the future as if it were a blank canvas waiting to be painted, while Arthur saw the future as an Excel spreadsheet, where every cell was already filled with mathematical precision. Deep down, he knew she dreamed of a family. He saw how her eyes would light up when they passed by parks and saw children playing, how she would stop to talk to babies in elevators, how she kept little toys she found on the streets, just in case. But he had been clear from the beginning. Children were not part of his plans, and his medical condition made it a natural impossibility. Or so he believed, until the day Eleanor arrived at his office with a different kind of smile and an ultrasound in her hands. A crushing lie. It was a rainy Tuesday in June when Eleanor appeared at Arthur's office unannounced. He was on a video conference with investors when his assistant knocked on the door with a nervous smile. Mr. Bennett, Ms. Vance is here. She says it's urgent. Arthur frowned. Eleanor never sought him out at work. She religiously respected the boundary he had established between his personal and professional life. Tell her to wait 15 minutes, he muttered, turning his attention back to the charts on the screen. But 15 minutes turned into 40, and when he finally opened the meeting room door, he found Eleanor sitting in the reception area, holding a brown envelope to her chest as if it were a treasure. She was wearing a yellow dress he had never seen before. Her hair was down, falling in waves over her shoulders, and there was something different about her face, a light he couldn't identify. Sorry for the delay, he said, kissing her cheek quickly. I had an important presentation. There's always something, she replied. But the tone wasn't a complaint. It was almost joyful. They walked into his office, and Arthur went straight to the chair behind his desk, maintaining a professional distance even in intimate moments. Eleanor remained standing, the envelope still pressed to her chest, her eyes shining in a way that left him uneasy. Arthur, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I need to tell you something. Something incredible. He crossed his arms, bracing himself for another one of her artistic ideas. Maybe a new exhibition, a trip she wanted to take, a change in her studio. I'm listening. Eleanor took a deep breath and opened the envelope, pulling out a small black and white photo. Her hands trembled as she placed it on the glass table, pushing it toward him like a sacred offering. I'm pregnant, Arthur. 12 weeks. The world stopped. Arthur stared at the ultrasound image, unable to fully process what he was seeing. A tiny human shape, with clearly defined arms and legs, floated in the center of the photo like an impossible miracle. This is a mistake, he said automatically, the voice coming out colder than he intended. You know I can't. But you can, Eleanor interrupted, her voice filled with emotion. The doctor explained that sometimes the body recovers, that infections like yours may not cause permanent infertility, It's our baby, Arthur. Our miracle. She walked over to the table, her eyes filled with tears of happiness. Just imagine, a little one with your eyes, with your intelligence, running around the house, filling our lives with laughter. But Arthur had already stood up, turning his back to the window that showed Chicago sprawling under the rain. Years of believing he could never be a father. Years of using that certainty as a shield against any dream of a family. Years of building an identity based on controlled solitude. "No," he said, not turning around. "This can't be happening. How can you say that?" Eleanor's voice trembled behind him, loaded with a pain Arthur could feel even without turning. "This baby is a gift, Arthur, a miracle that life is giving us." He kept staring out the window, watching the raindrops run down the glass like tears he couldn't shed. Chicago stretched out below, full of life, movement, and families walking down the streets with small children. A reality that had always seemed distant, impossible, and out of his reach. "Miracles don't exist, Eleanor," he said, finally turning to face her. "Medical facts do, and the fact is, I am infertile. But the proof is here," she exclaimed, pointing to the ultrasound on the table. "The proof is in front of you. Our son exists. He's growing inside me right now." Arthur looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. The yellow dress that accentuated her skin, the hands that trembled with emotion, the eyes filled with hope and love. For a second, a tiny part of his heart almost believed. He almost allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to hold a baby in his arms, to teach a child to walk, to be called Dad. But doubt was stronger than hope. 15 years of medical certainty couldn't be erased by a black and white photo and words about a spontaneous recovery. "Whose is it?" The question slipped from his lips before he could stop it, cold and sharp as a blade. Eleanor reeled back as if she had been slapped. "How? How could you ask that? Whose is it, mine, Arthur?" he repeated, crossing his arms. "Because we both know it's not mine." Tears began to run down her face, but there was something beyond sadness in her eyes. There was disbelief, as if she couldn't believe the words she was hearing. "Arthur, I love you. Only you. For 2 years. Only you. How could you think I would—" "Because it's the only logical explanation," he interrupted, his voice taking on the businesslike tone he used in difficult negotiations. "You know my condition. You always knew it. And now you show up here with this." He gestured toward the ultrasound, as if it were something disgusting. "This is our son," Eleanor cried, shouting for the first time since they had met. "Your son. Why can't you accept that maybe, just maybe, the doctors were wrong?" "Because I trust science, not fairy tales," he replied coldly. "And I'm not going to let myself be made a fool of." Eleanor walked to the table and took the ultrasound with hands that trembled violently. "Do you want paternity tests? DNA? Anything to prove this baby is yours?" "I want you to leave," he said, returning to his chair and pretending to organize papers. "And don't come back with this charade." The silence that followed was deafening. When Arthur finally looked up, Eleanor was standing in the doorway, holding the ultrasound against her chest, tears running silently down her face. "One day you will discover the truth," she whispered, "and you will regret this forever." The door closed softly behind her, and Arthur was left alone with his empire of glass and steel, exactly as he always wanted. A coward's regret. That night, Arthur came home determined to stand by his decision. The apartment in Logan Square was too quiet, and for the first time in 2 years, there was no scent of cinnamon and coffee that always announced Eleanor's presence. She was sitting on the balcony, looking out at the city lights, a small suitcase at her feet. "You're really leaving?" he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Eleanor didn't turn around. "I can't stay where I'm not believed, where my love is worth nothing. Arthur poured himself a shot of tequila and sat in the leather armchair across the room, maintaining the physical distance that reflected the emotional distance he had created between them. The liquid burned his throat, but it couldn't burn away the strange feeling that had been growing in his chest since that afternoon. "Where are you going?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Maple Hill, in Illinois. My sister Hannah has a spare room, and there's a community of artisans there. I can start over." With another man's child. Eleanor finally turned, and he saw that she had been crying a lot. Her eyes were red and swollen, but there was a new determination on her face he had never seen before. "With your son, Arthur. It always has been and always will be your son, no matter how many times you deny it." She stood up and walked toward him, stopping a few feet from the armchair. "You know I never lied to you. In 2 years, I never hid anything from you. I never betrayed you. I never did anything that would break your trust. Why would I start now?" Arthur took another drink, avoiding her gaze. "People change. Circumstances change." "I didn't change," she said softly. "My love for you didn't change. The only thing that changed is that now I carry a part of you inside me." She placed her hand on her belly, still unnoticeable, but real to her. "When this baby is born," she continued, "he'll have your eyes, your stubborn ways, maybe your intelligence for numbers. And I'll look at him every day and remember the man I loved, who was too much of a coward to believe in love." "Don't make me the villain in this story," Arthur retorted, standing up abruptly. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't promise this. From the beginning, I made it clear that you were infertile." "Yes," she interrupted. "But you never made it clear that you were also incapable of loving." Eleanor picked up her suitcase and walked to the door. On the threshold, she stopped and turned one last time. "I'm leaving my new address with Hannah, in case you change your mind, in case you decide to get another test, in case you want to meet your son when he's born, in case you decide to stop being afraid of happiness." The door closed softly, and Arthur was left alone with the silence he had always wanted, discovering that too much silence could also be a form of torture. The road to forgiveness the following months passed like a gray haze in Arthur's life. He plunged into work with an intensity that impressed even his most ambitious partners. He closed 3 major deals, expanded the company into Seattle and Portland, and worked 16-hour days as if exhaustion could silence the thoughts that insisted on visiting him in the early hours of the morning. But the nights were relentless. In the empty apartment, surrounded only by the hum of the city below, Arthur found himself staring at the balcony where Eleanor used to read her art books, the kitchen where she made cinnamon coffee every morning, the wall where there were still marks from the paintings she had taken with her. Dr. Hernandez, his doctor of over 15 years, was surprised when Arthur showed up at his office asking for new fertility tests. "But Arthur, we've talked about this several times. Your condition." "I want to make sure," he interrupted, avoiding explaining the true reasons. The results came back 2 weeks later. "Severe infertility, but not absolute," the report read, in technical language that Arthur reread dozens of times. "A very low number of viable sperm, but with a remote possibility of natural conception." Remote possibility. The words echoed in his mind as he walked through the streets of Chicago, watching families strolling together, fathers carrying small children on their shoulders, pregnant women holding hands with their partners. Had he been too hasty? Too cruel? But pride was stronger than doubt. Arthur had built his entire identity around control, around certainty, around the ability to predict and manage every aspect of his life. To admit he had been wrong, that he had hurt Eleanor unjustly, that he had lost the chance to be a father, that would mean admitting he wasn't the rationally infallible man he believed himself to be. In December, 6 months after Eleanor's departure, he almost called Hannah to ask for her sister's phone number. Almost. He got as far as dialing the number he found online. He heard Hannah's cheerful voice answer, but he hung up before she could say, "Hello." What would he say? How would he explain it? A father's redemption. Maria Carter's doctor was impressed with her physical and emotional strength at every checkup. "I've never seen such a serene pregnancy," he would comment. "This baby is growing up surrounded by a lot of love." Maria would smile, knowing it was true. Despite the pain of being rejected by the man she loved, she had found an inexhaustible source of love within herself, a love that didn't depend on anyone else, that grew with every one of Ava's movements, with every piece of furniture she created, with every day she woke up grateful to be alive. She had become a completely different woman from the one who had left Chicago, and that woman was ready to be a mother. Ava was born on a misty March morning when the first spring rains began to awaken the wildflowers in the Washington mountains. Labor was long but calm, with Maria maintaining a serenity that impressed the entire medical team at the small hospital. Hannah held her hand as she pushed, whispering words of encouragement. "Come on, sis. Your princess wants to meet the world." When Ava finally arrived, small and perfect, with dark, curly hair and powerful lungs that announced her arrival to the world, Maria felt her heart explode with a love she didn't know was possible. But it was when the nurse placed the baby in her arms that she saw something that made her world stop for an instant. On Ava's left arm, a tiny, unmistakable crescent moon birthmark was visible against her pink skin, identical to the one Arthur had in the same place, a mark he had shown her on an intimate night, telling her his mother said it was a sign of good luck. "My God," Maria whispered, tears running down her face as she delicately traced the small mark with her finger. "You really are your father's daughter." In the following days, as Ava settled into her new routine of feedings and naps, Maria found herself torn between the pure joy of motherhood and a deep yearning for Arthur to be there. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. The first cry, the first smile, the first sleepless nights caring for her daughter. In all those dreams, he was present. "Should I call him?" Hannah suggested one afternoon as she watched Maria breastfeed Ava on the balcony. "Tell him about the birth. He has a right to know." Maria shook her head softly. "He had 9 months to change his mind, to look for me, to believe me. If I call now, it will seem like I'm begging for his attention. But she's his daughter, Maria, and now you have proof he can't ignore." Maria looked at the crescent moon birthmark on Ava's arm, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. It was tempting. Very tempting. She imagined calling Arthur, describing the mark, watching him finally understand he had made a terrible mistake. But a part of her, the part that had grown and strengthened during those months, knew that wasn't how things should happen. "If he wants to know, Ava," she said finally, "it has to be because he decided to believe in love, not because he was presented with physical proof. Our daughter deserves a father who chooses her out of love, not out of obligation." Ava stirred in her arms, opening her dark eyes, so similar to Arthur's, and Maria felt a deep certainty that she was making the right decision. She and Ava were going to be fine, with or without him. A quiet life. Ava grew up to be a radiant little girl in the mountains of Washington. At 2, she was already running through the hallways of the cooperative where Eleanor worked, speaking an adorable mix of English and the few words in the local language she had learned from the artisans. Her strong personality was evident early on. She was as stubborn as the father she didn't know, but had the artistic sensitivity of her mother. "Mama, I want to make table 2, she would say, pulling on Maria's apron as she worked with wood. Maria had set up a small corner with toy tools where Ava would spend hours building her own creations. Eleanor's workshop had turned into a small, thriving business. Her furniture sold in art galleries and even in Chicago, combining local artisanal tradition with a contemporary design that caught the attention of decorators and collectors. She had managed to buy a small but charming little house in the historic center, with a patio where Ava played while she worked. "You've become a businesswoman," Hannah would observe proudly, watching her sister coordinate orders and manage 3 employees. "Who would have thought that dreamy artist from Chicago had that business acumen?" Maria would smile, but sometimes she wondered if Arthur would be proud to see her this way. She had developed a sharp mind for numbers and planning that she never knew she had, as if the need to provide for Ava had awakened dormant skills. At night, after Ava was asleep, Maria maintained a ritual that Hannah considered both painful and necessary. She would look up Arthur on the internet, follow the news of his businesses, and see photos of him at social events, always alone, always with the same controlled, distant expression she knew all too well. "He hasn't changed a bit," she would murmur to herself, looking at a photo of him at an inauguration in Portland. "He's still the same man afraid to feel." But there were moments when that certainty wavered. When Ava did something that reminded her of Arthur, like organizing her toys into perfect rows or counting her wooden blocks with mathematical seriousness, Maria would feel a pang of longing so intense she would have to sit down and take a deep breath. "Does Papa work far away?" Ava asked for the first time one Sunday afternoon, seeing other children playing with their fathers in the park. Maria's heart raced. She had prepared for that question for months, but she still wasn't ready. "Yes, my love, he has a very important job that keeps him far away. But does he love me?" The question came with the devastating innocence of children. "Of course he loves you," Maria replied without hesitation, because deep down in her heart, she still believed it. Sometimes adults get confused, but the love is always there. Ava accepted the explanation with the ease of small children, but Maria knew it wouldn't always be that way. One day her daughter would ask more difficult questions, and she would have to find answers that wouldn't hurt her, that wouldn't create anger or resentment. For now, it was enough that Ava was growing up surrounded by love, art, and the absolute certainty that she was wanted and valued. David Miller entered Maria's life one afternoon in October when Ava was 2.5. He appeared at the cooperative carrying a small puppy with an injured paw, looking for someone who could help improvise a temporary splint until he could get to the vet. "Sorry to bother you," he said, with a shy smile that lit up his face. "I know you work with wood. You might have something that could serve as a support for this little paw." Maria was sanding a table when she looked up and saw a tall man with broad shoulders and gentle hands holding the injured animal. There was something in his careful way of touching the dog that moved her immediately. "Of course," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ava, come see the puppy." The little girl ran to them curiously, and David knelt to her height, patiently explaining what had happened to the animal. "He's hurt, but he's going to be okay. Sometimes we need to take care of those who are hurt, right?" Ava nodded solemnly, and to Maria's surprise, she extended her small hand to pet the dog without showing any fear. "She likes animals," David observed, looking at Maria with approval. "She likes everything that needs care," Maria replied, watching how Ava talked softly to the dog in her adorable mix of English. David became a constant presence in their lives gradually and naturally. First, there were occasional visits to show how the dog was recovering. Ava had insisted on calling him Kojo because of his hurt paw. Then came invitations for weekend lunches, walks through the historic center, and afternoons at the park where Ava ran freely while they talked. No questions about her father, Maria commented one of those afternoons, watching Ava play with other children. It's none of my business, David replied simply. You two are a complete family. If you ever want to tell me, I'll listen. If not, that's okay too. It was that simplicity that most attracted Maria to David. He didn't try to solve her life or fill spaces she hadn't asked him to fill. He was just present, reliable, and gentle with Ava in a way that made Maria's heart warm and, at the same time, break a little. Uncle David, can you teach me to take care of Coho? Ava asked one afternoon, using for the first time the affectionate title David had naturally earned. Of course, Princess, he said. But first you have to learn that taking care of someone means being very patient and very gentle. Maria watched these interactions with conflicting feelings. It was wonderful to see Ava have a positive male figure in her life, someone who treated her with the affection and attention every child deserved. But it also stirred an old pain, the constant reminder that those scenes should have had Arthur as the protagonist. David deserved a woman who could love him completely, without ghosts from the past. Ava deserved a father who chose her out of love, not out of convenience. But for now, Maria allowed herself to enjoy the peace David brought into their lives. The beginning of a new life. While Maria was building a new life in rural Washington, Arthur was facing the biggest professional challenge of his career. A group of Japanese investors had shown interest in acquiring a significant portion of his company, but demanded expansion into alternative tourist markets. Washington had emerged as a golden opportunity: cheap land, unexplored tourism potential, and attractive government incentives. San Cristobal is perfect, his partner Robert explained during a morning meeting in the Chicago Tower. Cultural tourism, proximity to the city, preserved colonial architecture. The Japanese are talking about investing $20 million if we can establish a solid base there. Arthur stared out the window, trying to ignore the strange feeling the city's name gave him. San Cristobal, the place where Eleanor had fled 3 years earlier, where she had built her new life away from him. For months, he had managed to push those thoughts to the back of his mind, but now they were returning with full force. Are there any historical properties available? He asked, keeping his voice professional. Several. Colonial houses that can be converted into boutique hotels, land with a panoramic view of the mountains, an old hacienda that needs a complete restoration. I need someone to go there to do an on-site evaluation. Arthur knew he should send Robert or one of the other partners. It was the most logical, most professional decision. But a force he couldn't name made him hesitate. I'll go, he heard himself say. Robert looked surprised. You yourself? But we have that project in Seattle that needs your attention. Seattle can wait. If we're going to invest $20 million in Washington, I want to personally see what we're buying. That night, alone in his apartment, Arthur wondered if he wasn't making a mistake. 3 years had passed. Eleanor had probably moved on, perhaps even found someone new. The child, if she really existed, if she was really his, would be 2 years old by now, a real person with her own personality, no longer just an ultrasound image. He had become an expert at stifling those thoughts, but the prospect of being in the same town as them brought them to the surface with renewed intensity. What if he ran into Eleanor by chance? What if he saw the girl? How would he react? How would he explain 3 years of silence? His doctor had called the previous week with the results of his routine checkups. Your sperm count has improved significantly, Arthur. I don't know what you're doing differently, but your body seems to be recovering well from the old infection. The words resonated in his mind as he booked his flight to Washington. Recovery. Possibility. Words that came too late, loaded with a weight he didn't know if he could carry. Robert had warned him that the business trip would last at least a week. A whole week in the town where Eleanor lived. A week to find out if he still thought about her, if he still loved her, if he was still too much of a coward to admit he had made the biggest mistake of his life. The flight was scheduled for Sunday, a Sunday in March, exactly 3 years after he had pushed Eleanor out of his life. The flight from Chicago to Seattle was a rough one, with turbulence that seemed to reflect Arthur's emotional state. During the 2-hour car ride to the town, he tried to focus on the documents for the properties he was going to evaluate, but his eyes kept getting lost in the mountainous landscape that unfolded outside the window of the rented car. The town welcomed him with a crystalline blue sky and cobblestone streets that seemed to whisper stories of centuries past. The town was smaller than he imagined, more intimate, and more welcoming than the urban centers where he was used to doing business. Arthur checked into a small hotel in the historic center and spent the first day visiting the properties on his list. An 18th century house that could be converted into a boutique hotel, a piece of land with a panoramic view of the mountains, an old hacienda that needed a complete restoration. Work, numbers, cost-benefit analysis. It was all very familiar, very safe, but on every corner he turned, in every square he crossed, his eyes involuntarily searched for a familiar face. How many times did he think he saw Eleanor walking in the distance, only to find it was a stranger with similar hair? How many times did his heart race when he heard a woman's laugh that could have been hers? The second night, dining alone at a restaurant near the hotel, Arthur overheard a conversation at the next table that made his blood run cold. "Eleanor makes the most beautiful furniture in town," a woman was saying to her companion. "You need to see her workshop at the cooperative, and her little girl is such a sweetheart." Little girl. Then it was true. The child existed. She had survived. She was growing up right here, just a few blocks from where he was sitting, pretending to eat his dish. "What's the girl's name?" the other woman asked. "Ava. A beautiful, smart little girl. It seems she got her mother's brains." Arthur dropped his fork on his plate with a clatter that made the women turn to look at him. He mumbled an apology and tried to return to his meal, but the words echoed in his mind. Ava. His daughter had a name, a personality, and was being described as smart and beautiful by strangers who knew her better than he did. That night, lying in his hotel bed, Arthur stared at the ceiling for hours without being able to sleep. She was there, just a few minutes' walk away. Eleanor and Ava, living their lives, building memories, creating bonds that didn't include him. 3 years of history he had missed. 3 years he could never get back. In the morning, he canceled 2 scheduled visits and went for a walk through the streets of the town without a specific destination. He just walked, breathing the thin mountain air, trying to muster the courage to do something he should have done 3 years ago. Find them, beg for forgiveness, and try to rebuild what he had destroyed with his cowardice and pride. The artisan market was held on Sundays in the town square. It was Sunday. The artisan market was bustling with life when Arthur arrived that Sunday morning. Families were strolling among the colorful stalls. Children were running between adults' legs. Vendors were offering their wares with genuine smiles. The smell of local coffee, mixed with incense, floated in the air, creating an almost magical atmosphere that was in stark contrast to the nervousness growing in Arthur's chest. He walked slowly among the stalls, feigning interest in the products on display, while his eyes scanned every female face. Traditional textiles, amber jewelry, hand-painted pottery. Everything passed by in a blur as his heart beat faster and faster. What if she wasn't there? What if she had changed so much he wouldn't recognize her? And then he saw her. Eleanor was behind a stall full of small wooden furniture and decorative objects, explaining the process in detail to an interested client. Her hair was shorter, pulled back in an informal bun, and she was wearing a simple blue cotton dress that accentuated her natural tan. There was something different about her posture, more confident, more self-assured, but her smile was still the same one that had conquered Arthur in that art gallery 5 years ago. A little girl was playing by her side, building towers with small wooden blocks. She had dark, curly hair, brown skin, and graceful, determined movements. Ava, his daughter. Arthur felt his legs tremble. For 3 years, he had imagined this moment, but no fantasy had prepared him for the reality of seeing his own flesh and blood for the first time. Ava was real, alive, and perfect. The little girl ran to Eleanor with a wooden block in her hand, showing her something she had created. It was at that moment that Arthur saw something that made his world stop completely. On Ava's left arm, clear and unmistakable, was a crescent moon birthmark, exactly like his own, in the same place and the same size. The air left his lungs as if he had been punched. There was no more doubt, no more possibility of denial. Ava was his daughter, flesh of his flesh, blood of his blood, literally carrying his genetic mark on her body. His legs began to buckle, and he leaned against a nearby tree, trying to process the magnitude of what he was seeing. 3 years lost. 3 years that this beautiful little girl had grown up without a father, that Eleanor had raised a child alone, and that he had wasted the opportunity to be part of the most precious family he could ever have. Eleanor finished with the client and turned to put some objects away. It was then that her eyes found his across the crowd. Arthur saw the exact moment she recognized him. Her eyes widened, her smile disappeared, and she instinctively pulled Ava closer to her, as if shielding her daughter from a threat. They stared at each other for long seconds, separated by physical distance and by 3 years of pain, silence, and regret. Arthur walked slowly toward them, like someone approaching a wounded animal that might run away at any sudden movement. Each step seemed to last an eternity. Each heartbeat echoed in his ears like a war drum. The sounds of the market, conversations, laughter, background music, all faded into a distant murmur as his attention focused entirely on the woman and the child who were watching him. "Eleanor," he said, when he was close enough for her to hear him without needing to shout. His voice came out huskier than usual, loaded with 3 years of unsaid words. Eleanor raised her chin in a show of strength he immediately recognized. It was the same gesture she made when she was bracing herself for a difficult discussion, when she was gathering all her inner courage to face something that scared her. "Arthur," she replied, her voice controlled, but with a slight tremor that betrayed her apparent calm. "What are you doing here?" Ava, curious about the stranger's presence, looked at him with big, expressive eyes that were astonishingly similar to his own. She showed no fear, just a natural childlike curiosity about someone new. I'm here for work," he lied partially, unable to admit that he had come specifically looking for her, evaluating properties for a hotel project. "What a coincidence," Eleanor said, and there was a touch of sarcasm in her voice he knew well. Arthur looked at Ava, who was now playing with her wooden blocks again, seemingly uninterested in the adult's conversation. The birthmark on her arm was even more evident up close, a perfect crescent moon that left no room for doubt about his paternity. She has the same mark as me," he murmured, barely managing to articulate the words. Eleanor followed his gaze, and for a moment her mask of control wavered. "I don't know what you're talking about, Arthur." "Eleanor, please." He took a step closer, and she instinctively pulled Ava even closer. The mark on her arm is identical to mine. You know it. Ava looked up from her toys and stared at Arthur with renewed curiosity. Mama, who is he? The simple, innocent question hit Arthur like a bullet to the chest. His daughter didn't know him. To her, he was just a stranger interrupting her morning of playing at the market. Eleanor knelt to Ava's level, keeping her eyes on Arthur as she spoke to her daughter. He's just a man I met a long time ago, my love. An important man? Ava asked, remembering the story her mom always told her about her father, who worked far away. The world stopped again. Eleanor looked him in the eyes, and he saw in that gaze a forgiveness he didn't deserve. A second chance he had squandered. A love that had survived 3 years of abandonment and rejection. Yes, Eleanor said softly, without looking away from him. A very important man. Ava stood up and walked over to Arthur with the fearless confidence that only small children possess. She stopped right in front of him, tilted her head back so she could see his face, and extended her arm with the birthmark. Look, I have a moon, she said proudly, as if she were showing him the most precious treasure in the world. Arthur slowly knelt to her level and, with trembling hands, rolled up his shirt sleeve, revealing the identical mark on his left arm. I have a moon too, he said, his voice choked with emotion. Ava's eyes widened in surprise and delight. She looked from her mark to his, then back to hers, processing the impossible coincidence with the simple logic of children. They're the same, she exclaimed, delicately touching the mark on Arthur's arm. Mama, look, he has a moon just like mine. Eleanor had stood up and was watching them with tears in her eyes. 3 years of secrets. 3 years of protecting Ava from the painful truth. 3 years of building a careful narrative about the absent father. It all came crashing down in that simple, pure moment of recognition. Ava, Eleanor said softly, her voice trembling. Do you want to know who this man is? The little girl was excited, still fascinated by the discovery of the matching marks. Eleanor took a deep breath, looked Arthur in the eyes, and he saw in that gaze a forgiveness he didn't deserve. A second chance he had squandered, a love that had survived 3 years of abandonment and rejection. This is your daddy, my love, Eleanor whispered. The daddy I always told you worked far away. The world stopped once more. Ava looked from Eleanor to Arthur, then back to Eleanor, her little eyes processing the most important information of her young life. Arthur felt as if he were about to faint, as if the ground were about to disappear from under his feet. My daddy? Ava asked, her voice small but full of curiosity. The real daddy? Yes, princess, Eleanor whispered. Your real daddy. Ava turned to Arthur, who was still kneeling in front of her, and asked the question he knew was coming. The question for which he had no adequate answer. Why were you gone for so long? Arthur felt tears run down his face, the first tears he had shed since the infertility diagnosis 15 years ago. How could he explain to a 3-year-old about fear, pride, and cowardice? How could he tell his own daughter that he had rejected her even before he knew her? Because I was very scared, he said finally, with the brutal honesty that only children deserve. Scared that I wouldn't be a good dad for you. Ava considered this answer with the seriousness children dedicate to important matters. Then, with a smile that simultaneously broke and rebuilt Arthur's heart, she extended her small hand and touched his tear-streaked face. But you're not scared anymore? Ava's question echoed in the air, like a direct challenge to Arthur's soul. Still kneeling in front of his daughter, he looked into her eyes that were mirrors of his own, and felt the weight of 3 years of wrong decisions pressing on his shoulders. I'm still scared, he admitted, his voice coming out in a rough whisper. But now I know that fear is no excuse to be away from the ones we love. Ava nodded with the inexplicable wisdom of children who grow up feeling the lack of something important. Uncle David said that when we're scared, we need to be brave anyway. The mention of another man in his daughter's life hit Arthur like a punch. Of course, there would be another man. Of course, Eleanor would have moved on, built a new life, found someone who knew how to value what he had rejected. He looked at Eleanor over Ava's head. "Uncle David? A friend," Eleanor replied quickly. But there was something in her voice, a defensiveness he recognized, an instinctive protection of something precious. Arthur stood up slowly, still processing the magnitude of what he had discovered. His daughter existed. She was real. She was perfect. But she also had a completely formed life, established relationships, and a routine that didn't include him. 3 years was an eternity in a little girl's life. "Can we talk?" he asked Eleanor. "Alone?" Eleanor hesitated, looking at Ava, who was now playing with her blocks again, seemingly absorbed in her constructions after the intense emotional moment. "Hannah?" Eleanor called to a nearby woman, who immediately approached. Arthur recognized Eleanor's sister from the photos she had shown him years ago. Hannah looked at him with a coldness that made her opinion of his sudden appearance very clear. "Can you stay with Ava for a few minutes?" Eleanor asked. Hannah nodded and sat down next to the girl, beginning to help her with the blocks. Ava accepted the change naturally, but her eyes constantly returned to Arthur, as if she were checking to see if he was still there. Eleanor gestured to a small corner away from the stall, out of earshot of Ava and Hannah. When they got there, she turned to him with her arms crossed, a defensive posture he knew well. 3 years, Arthur," she said, her voice controlled but heavy with pain. 3 years without a word, without a question, without a moment of curiosity about what happened to the child you said was impossible. "I know," he replied, knowing there were no sufficient excuses. "I know I was a coward. I made the biggest mistake of my life. I destroyed the best thing I had." "And now?" she asked, tears finally beginning to escape. "Now you show up here. You see the physical proof that I was always telling the truth, and you expect what? That I'll just forget everything?" Arthur took a step toward her, but she backed away. "I hope for a chance to try and fix what I broke," he said. "A chance to know my daughter. A chance to prove I can be the man you deserve." Eleanor looked at him for long seconds, her eyes filled with tears she was refusing to let fall completely. In the distance, Ava was laughing with Hannah, building towers higher and higher with her colorful blocks, oblivious to the conversation that would determine her future. "You don't understand, Arthur," Eleanor said finally, her voice trembling. "It's not just that you show up and decide you want to be a father now. Ava has a life, routines, people who love her. She's been asking me about you for months, and I've had to make up stories about why her dad couldn't visit." Arthur felt every word like a stab. "What kind of stories? That you work very far away, that you have important responsibilities, that you love her even if you can't be here." Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Pious lies to protect a 3-year-old's heart. They don't have to be lies," he said desperately. "I can change. I can transfer my business, set up an office here." Eleanor interrupted him. The great Arthur Bennett leaving Chicago, leaving his glass and steel empire to come live in a small town in Washington? There was sarcasm in her voice, but also something else, a cautious hope she was trying to hide behind irritation. "For her, yes," Arthur replied, looking in Ava's direction. "For both of you. For us. There is no us, Arthur. There's Ava. There's me. There's the life we built here. And there's David." The mention of the name again made Arthur's stomach clench. "Do you love him?" Eleanor hesitated, a doubt that lasted only a second, but that he noticed. "David is a good man. He's gentle. He treats Ava like she's his own daughter. He's never disappointed me, never rejected me, never made me feel like a liar for telling the truth." Every word was a painful comparison, a reminder of everything he had lost through his cowardice. "But you didn't answer my question," he insisted softly. Eleanor looked away, watching Ava trying to teach Hannah how to stack blocks in a specific order. "What I feel or don't feel doesn't matter anymore. What matters is Ava. She deserves stability, not a father who shows up suddenly and might disappear again when things get hard." "I won't disappear," Arthur promised, taking a step toward her. "Eleanor, I spent 3 years dying inside. 3 years knowing I had made the biggest mistake of my life. 3 years trying to convince myself I made the right decision when I knew deep down I had destroyed the only chance for real happiness I would ever have." For the first time since their reunion, Eleanor looked him directly in the eyes, and he saw in them the woman he had loved. Vulnerable, hopeful, but also cautious. "Words are easy, Arthur. You were always good with words when you wanted something. Then give me the chance to prove it with actions," he pleaded. "Let me know, Ava. Let me show you that I've changed." A father's redemptions. 3 days later, Arthur was sitting in a small cafe in the center of town, his hands trembling slightly as he waited. Eleanor had agreed to let him spend an afternoon with Ava. 2 supervised hours in a public place, far from the emotional intensity of their first reunion. Ava arrived holding Eleanor's hand, wearing a little yellow dress and carrying a fabric doll. Her eyes found Arthur immediately, and when they did, she gave him a shy but genuine smile. "Hello, Papa," she said, the word coming out naturally, as if she had been practicing it for the last few days. Arthur's heart almost stopped. Papa. His daughter had called him Papa for the first time, and the sound was sweeter than any music he had ever heard. "Hello, Princess," he replied, kneeling to her level. "Did you bring your doll?" Ava nodded and showed him the doll. "Her name is Luna, after our Mark." Arthur looked at Eleanor, who was watching the interaction with cautious but not hostile eyes. She was wearing a simple cotton blouse, and her hair was down. She looked as beautiful as ever, but there was a sadness in her eyes he knew he had caused. "Can I meet Luna?" he asked Ava, who immediately handed him the doll. Over the next 2 hours, Arthur discovered that his daughter was a charming little chatterbox. She talked about Kojo, Uncle David's puppy, about the craft classes her mom taught, and about how she liked to help out at the cooperative by organizing the small pieces of wood by color and size. Do you know how to count?" he asked, reminded of his own childhood obsession with numbers. Ava nodded proudly and began counting to 20 in English. Then she repeated it in the local language, to Arthur's astonishment. "Aunt Hannah taught me," she explained. "She says it's important to know how to talk to everyone." Arthur looked at Eleanor, who had remained silent for most of the meeting, watching every interaction with protective attention. "She's amazing," he murmured. "She's everything to me," Eleanor replied, and there was a subtle warning in her voice. When it was time to say goodbye, Ava surprised everyone by walking up to Arthur and giving him a tight hug. "Are you going away again?" she asked, looking him in the eyes with a seriousness that broke his heart. "No, Princess. Papa is going to stay around here. Promise?" The simple question carried the weight of all the adults who had ever promised Ava things and then disappeared from her life. Arthur looked at Eleanor, who was watching him intently. "I promise," he said, knowing he was making the most important commitment of his life. Ava smiled and gave him another hug before running back to Eleanor. As he watched them walk away down the cobblestone street, Arthur knew that his life had changed forever. No matter what it cost, no matter how many sacrifices he had to make, he would not lose Ava again. And if he was lucky, maybe he wouldn't lose Eleanor either. The last promise. A week later, Arthur was in the makeshift office of his hotel, surrounded by contracts, sales proposals, and documents that represented 15 years of his professional life. His company in Chicago was worth millions, but for the first time in his life, money and power seemed insignificant compared to what truly mattered. He had spent the last few days with Ava, whenever Eleanor allowed it. Afternoons in the park, visits to the cooperative, where she played among the wooden tools, walks through the colonial streets, where she pointed out every architectural detail with the infinite curiosity of small children. Each moment together confirmed what he already knew. Ava was his daughter in every sense, and he had wasted 3 precious years of his life. But Eleanor remained distant, cordial, respectful, but distant. She let him spend time with Ava, but she never allowed herself to be alone with him, never completely let down her guard. And David. David appeared regularly, bringing Ava gifts, having dinner with them, occupying the space that should have been his. Arthur picked up his phone and called Robert, his partner in Chicago. "How are the negotiations with the Japanese going?" "Suspended," Arthur replied. "Robert, I need to talk to you about something important. I'm transferring my main operations to rural Washington." Silence on the other end of the line. "You're kidding, right? Arthur, we have $20 million contracts in progress, and you can handle it all. I'm keeping my partnership stake, but I need to be here." "For a woman?" Arthur hesitated. It was more complicated than that, but it was also exactly that. "For my daughter and for the woman I love." He hung up before Robert could reply and immediately called Dr. Hernandez. "Doctor, I need all my medical records from the last 5 years, originals, certified. It's for a paternity process." "Paternity? But Arthur, you said you were infertile." "Apparently, I was wrong about a lot of things." That afternoon, Arthur went to the cooperative where Eleanor worked. She was alone, sanding a small table with precise, graceful movements. Ava was at Hannah's house, giving them a chance to talk without the innocent presence that made everything more complicated. "I brought some documents," he said, placing an envelope on her workbench. Eleanor stopped sanding and looked at him with curiosity. "My complete medical records, proof that my infertility wasn't absolute, that Ava is truly my biological daughter." "I never doubted it," she said softly. "I also brought my company transfer papers. I'm setting up an office here in this town, not as a visitor, not as a tourist, but as a permanent resident." Eleanor let go of the sandpaper completely, looking at him with genuine surprise. "Eleanor, I know you may never forgive me. I know it may be too late for us, but it's not too late for Ava. And I'm not going to make the mistake of abandoning her again." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "David is a lucky man. I hope he knows the treasure he has." A quiet life. 6 months later, Arthur woke up in a small but cozy apartment in the center of town, with a view of the mountains that was now part of his morning routine. The smell of local coffee drifted up from the kitchen, mixed with the sound of a child's laughter coming from the building's inner courtyard. His new life had settled into a completely different rhythm from the one he knew in Chicago. His office occupied 2 floors of a restored colonial house where he coordinated small but significant real estate projects, family run-ins, local restaurants, and cultural spaces that respected the town's historic architecture. His partners in Chicago had initially resisted the change, but the financial results spoke for themselves. Sustainable tourism was the future, and Arthur had positioned himself at the forefront of that trend. More important than business, however, was the routine he had built with Ava. Every Wednesday and Saturday belonged to them. Long afternoons exploring the town, teaching her about numbers and construction, and listening to her stories about school and her friends. Ava had adapted to her father's presence with a child's natural ease, treating him as a permanent part of her life. "Papa, are you going to the school party on Friday?" she had asked him the night before as they played with building blocks in his apartment. "Of course, Princess. I wouldn't miss it for anything. Mama said that you and she are going to sit together." Arthur had felt his heart race with that information. In recent weeks, Eleanor had become less distant, more open to the idea of co-parenting, even if they weren't a couple. It was progress, however slow. David had gradually left their lives, not out of conflict or drama, but out of the gentle realization that Arthur was genuinely committed to staying, and that Eleanor needed space to figure out what she truly wanted. Ava deserves to have her real father nearby, he had said in a mature and respectful conversation that left Arthur even more aware of the good man who had almost taken his place. On the morning of that special Saturday, Arthur arrived at Eleanor's house to pick up Ava and found her in the garden watering the plants that had grown lush under the Washington sun. She was wearing a simple blue cotton dress, the same color she wore the day he first saw her in the market. "Good morning," he said, and for the first time in months, she smiled at him. Not the polite, cautious smile that had become habitual, but the genuine smile he remembered from 5 years ago. "Ava was getting ready," she said. "Would you like some coffee while you wait?" They sat in the small patio drinking coffee in a comfortable silence, while they listened to Ava humming in the next room. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, creating golden patterns on the stone floor, and for the first time since he had arrived in the town, Arthur felt something he hadn't felt in years. Complete peace. Maybe love could be rebuilt, brick by brick, like a new house on an old but solid foundation. I invite you to leave your opinion about this incredible story in the comments. If you liked it, share it, and subscribe to the channel to support our work. Another story is appearing on your screen that will probably also move you. Don't miss it.